So in this lecture, we're going to look at entrepreneurship in theory and practice, mostly focused on what economists understand by the concept of entrepreneurship and why it's relevant for managers today. So just by way of introduction, entrepreneurship really is not compatible with mainstream neoclassical economic theory. So there's always been this interesting disjoint where entrepreneurship has been almost outside of the traditional economics discipline. Entrepreneurship as a field became very popular in the 1980s, 1990s. This was a rise in the study of entrepreneurship, possibly due to Reagan and Thatcher's supply-side revolution, so their focus on creating an environment conducive to business, I think, contributed to the rise in the interest in entrepreneurship. There was reduced barriers to starting a business, and therefore people took this more seriously. But this has mainly been conducted in business schools rather than traditional economics departments. And so again, there's this disjoint between the kind of theory and the practice side of things. I think business schools teach a lot about entrepreneurship. Traditional economic departments spend less time on entrepreneurship because entrepreneurship is seen as being a practical discipline. And in this lecture, I want to try and bridge those two things together so we can understand the theory of entrepreneurship and its relevance. Now, if we're thinking about the definition of an entrepreneur, a provisional definition that we can start off with is a dictionary definition that says an entrepreneur is somebody who organizes, operates, and assumes the risk for a business venture. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate definition of an entrepreneur. It originates from the French verb entreprendre, which loosely means to undertake. And so if there's one image you should keep in mind when thinking about entrepreneurship, is that an entrepreneur is an undertaker. And here is the undertaker from the world of wrestling. This is the guy to keep in mind. He is the classic provisional form of entrepreneur. In terms of some early theories of entrepreneurship, Richard Cantillon was one of the first main theorists that studied the concept of entrepreneurship. His definition was very consistent with this view that the entrepreneur is an undertaker of business ventures. He spoke about how entrepreneurs buy their inputs at a known price and then sell their output at an unknown price. So when you're making a product, you know how much it will cost to buy your inputs. You don't know how much you'll be able to sell the final good for, and so you're bridging this passage of time, the known versus the unknown. It's this exposure to risk that defines the entrepreneur's action. This brings us, though, to the distinction, I think, between risk and the concept of uncertainty. And so whilst Cantillon spoke in terms of risk, I think it's very important to make a distinction between risk and uncertainty, and many important academics have done this as well. When we talk about risk, what we're really referring to is some kind of classification or some kind of probability distribution. A risky event is an event that we can reduce to probability theory on the grounds that there's some underlying distribution that we can work with. To some extent, we can think of risk as being, by definition, quantifiable, and therefore it's inherently quantitative in its nature, and we use tools such as possibly econometrics as a means of attempting to measure and understand the risks that we are facing. Now, I think we can contrast this with the concept of uncertainty, which was much broader, much deeper, and is defined in terms of a much more qualitative approach to science. In the field of uncertainty, we can say there's no prior information with which we can build some kind of probability distribution. There's no set of events which we can use as a backdrop to understand the likelihood of an individual event. It means that measurement is essentially impossible, and therefore we're forced to deal with more qualitative tools such as scenarios. So as an economist myself, I like using the scenario method. Partly that's because I treat uncertainty seriously, and I think there's a fundamental disjoint amongst economists who use quantitative techniques to try and cope with the concept of uncertainty. Now, I'm not the only economist that's made this very key distinction. In fact, a number of different economists who may disagree on many other things, but they do agree on this importance of uncertainty as distinct from risk. Ludwig von Mises emphasized that the entrepreneurs act under conditions of uncertainty. He said, like every acting man, the entrepreneur is always a speculator. He deals with the uncertain conditions of the future. Success or failure depends on the correctness of anticipation of uncertain events. If he fails in his understanding of things to come, he is doomed. The only source from which an entrepreneur's profits stem is his ability to anticipate better than the other people the future demand of the consumers. So entrepreneurship is all about coping with conditions of uncertainty. Frank Knight is the economist that made the clearest distinction between risk and uncertainty. In this extensive quote here, he said it's this third type of probability or uncertainty which has been neglected in economic theory and which we propose to put in its rightful place. As we have repeatedly pointed out, an uncertainty which can by any method be reduced to an objective, quantitatively determined probability can be reduced to complete certainty by grouping cases. The business world has evolved several organization devices for effectuating this consolidation, with the result that when the technique of business organization is fairly developed, measurable uncertainties do not introduce into business any uncertainty whatever. It is this true uncertainty which, by preventing the theoretically perfect outworking of the tendencies of competition, gives the characteristic form of enterprise to economic organization as a whole and accounts for the peculiar income of the entrepreneur. He's making this point that entrepreneurs are distinct from other types of actor in an economy. Entrepreneurs are the recipients of a type of income that's attributable to their exposure to uncertainty. Frank Knight was well aware that even when he was writing in the 1920s, that financial markets had evolved to allow people to buy insurance products, for example, as a means of mitigating and minimizing their risk. And the extent to which you can buy an insurance product to protect yourself against something means that you're utilizing the large number of cases with which you can use probability theory to work in your favor. If you can insure against risk, then we're not talking about uncertainty in the sense that we are here. Uncertainty is what kind of underpins, it's the general pool of phenomena. Risk might be these odd occasions where we can quantify, we can put a numerical value on it, we can buy an insurance product to protect ourselves from it. But those aren't the things that should be keeping business owners awake at night. What keeps business owners awake at night is uncertainty, which are the things that we haven't anticipated and that we can't reduce to risk. It's this leftover exposure to uncertainty that gives the entrepreneur their income. Keynes was very good on this as well. He said, by uncertain knowledge, let me explain. I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probable. The game of roulette is not subject in this sense to uncertainty. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence. About these matters there is no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know. So once again, it's this distinction between risk, which is reducible to calculable probability, versus uncertainty, which by definition is not. Perhaps the most famous explanation of the distinction between risk and uncertainty and genuine uncertainty was made by Donald Rumsfeld. He famously said, reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. I view this as a very sophisticated discussion of economic methodology, which is that these unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know where our ignorance lies, is critically important. And it's this exposure to uncertainty, these unknown unknowns, that generates the income for an entrepreneur and the real challenges of being a business person in the first place. I would use this concept of unknown unknowns. I'd call this Knightian uncertainty after Frank Knight. I would think that if we use the word uncertainty, that's really what we're getting at. But some people need to make this even clearer distinction. They'd refer to it as Knightian uncertainty, maybe sheer uncertainty, or maybe just unknown unknowns following Donald Rumsfeld. Now, in terms of the theory of entrepreneurship, more recently, this is looking really in the 20th century now, the two key figures that we're going to look at are Joseph Schumpeter and Israel Kirzner. I think that collectively these are two economists that have done the most important work on entrepreneurship theory. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can read them as being antagonistic to each other, or whether or not we can possibly try to reconcile them. But undoubtedly these are the two key figures, and it's worth just looking about what they've written and how they understood the entrepreneur. So firstly, with Schumpeter, he talked a lot about the importance of new combinations. So if we want to think about entrepreneurship, it's about new combinations. The different employment of the economic system's existing supplies of productive means. So the different employment is thinking about how we use resources and how we change the use of those resources. He argued that development is defined by the carrying out of new combinations. New combinations are, as a rule, embodied in firms which generally do not arise out of the old ones but start producing beside them. It is not the owner of a stagecoach who builds railways. So there's a couple of key terms here to pay attention to. Firstly, he's talking about development. So in Schumpeter's term, new combinations and entrepreneurship is fundamentally linked to economic development more generally. And then he's also making this empirical claim that these new combinations tend to come from new firms. And there's empirical evidence on this, which we can talk about in a little bit. It's not the owner of a stagecoach who builds railways. There's this idea that new firms are an important means of generating these new combinations. The fundamental impulse that sets and keeps the capitalist engine in motion comes from the new consumers' goods, the new methods of production or transportation, the new markets, the new forms of industrial organization that capitalist enterprises create. So again, just focus on some of these keywords here. It's all about things that are new, things that are different, and there's a lot of creativity here as well. Now, new combinations go beyond new products. So when we think about new combinations, it's not just about bringing new products to market. Schumpeter made a distinction between new products. So this might be something consumers aren't familiar with, or an improvement on the quality of an existing product. This is often what we think about as being innovation. It's when we bring new products to market or we improve existing ones. But Schumpeter has a much broader view. He talks about new production methods. So these can be technological improvements or a new way of handling a product commercially. He spoke about new markets. So you can create a brand new market yourself or sell the product in an existing market that it wasn't previously sold. That counts as a new combination. New sources of materials, so either newly created or simply applied from other sectors. They may be raw materials or half manufactured. And also the new organization of industry, such as increased market power or more competition. So we need to understand the entire industry structure to understand the nature of competition and also the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship. But notice how broad this is about what constitutes innovative behavior. The key term really is innovation for Schumpeter. He says innovation is the outstanding fact in the economic history of capitalist society, or in what is purely economic in that history. And also it is largely responsible for most of what we at first sight attribute to other factors. He identifies innovation as this key driving force. Surely nothing can be more plain or even more trite common sense that the proposition that innovation, as conceived by us, is at the centre of practically all the phenomena, difficulties and problems of economic life in capitalist society. Individual innovations imply, by virtue of their nature, a big step and a big change. A railway through a new country, i.e. country not yet served by railroads, as soon as it gets into working order, upsets all conditions of location, all cost calculations, all production functions within its radius of influence, and hardly any ways of doing things which have been optimal before remain so afterward. I find it fascinating when reading Schumpeter just to think about the vision that he has here for this capitalist system, about innovation, about new discovery, about the creative process, about how these innovations fundamentally change marketplaces and products aligned with them. This final quote: "It is by no means far-fetched or paradoxical to say that progress unstabilizes the economic world, or that it, by its nature of its mechanism, a cyclical process." So again, this is this very exciting view that progress is unstabilizing, that it disrupts, that the economy is fundamentally prone to these big changes as a consequence of innovation. Now, one important thing to note is that innovation is not the same thing as invention. And so this is talking about what innovation is not. Schumpeter said, as long as they are not carried into practice, inventions are economically irrelevant. To carry any improvement into effect is a task entirely different from the inventing of it. Although, of course, entrepreneurs may be inventors, they are inventors not by nature, but by coincidence and vice versa. And so what he's getting at here is that if the invention doesn't find its way to market, then there's no economic point to that invention. Maybe an achievement, maybe something that an individual tinkerer can be proud of, but it's by putting it to market and getting it into the hands of the consumer that it constitutes innovation. This function does not essentially consist in either inventing anything or otherwise creating the conditions which the enterprise exploits. It consists in getting things done. So Schumpeter gives a lot more credit to the person who goes about bringing things to market, as opposed to the person that comes up with the original ideas. And then finally, I just want to make this point about creative destruction. So you may well be familiar with the concept of creative destruction. And this is a term coined by Schumpeter, and hopefully by now you can really see how it generates and how it originates with the work that he was doing on entrepreneurship. He said the opening up of new markets, foreign or domestic, and the organizational development from the craft shop and factory to such concerns as US Steel illustrate the same process of industrial mutation, if I may use that biological term, that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. This process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. It is what capitalism consists in and what every capitalist concern has got to live in. You can actually see in here maybe why some people are anti-capitalist. If they like the world as it is, then they may be scared of these creative destructive forces that causes things to change. But also notice here the use of the biological term of mutation. It generates something that we'll talk about later about the organic nature of economic activity and about how this is something that generates some interesting forms of order. Every piece of business strategy acquires its true significance only against the background of that process and within the situation created by it. It must be seen in its role in the perennial gale of creative destruction. It cannot be understood irrespective of it, or in fact on the hypothesis that there is a perennial lull. So if you consider yourself to be an entrepreneur, I'm sure you've heard the concept of creative destruction, and this vision of the entrepreneur as this force that disrupts, that creates new things, originates from Schumpeter. Now, just to go back to this point about entrepreneurship being about bringing things to market, Bill Gates was often criticized as a consequence of the fact that there was other people in the tech industry that invented the software and hardware that Microsoft became very, very profitable for selling. But the Economist in this quote here uses a Schumpeterian view as a defense of Bill Gates. It says the technology industry likes to sneer at Microsoft as a follower, and it is true that the company has time and again bought in or imitated the technology of others. That very first PC operating system was based on someone else's code. But Mr. Gates's invention was as a businessman. His genius was to understand what he needed and work out how to obtain it, however long it took. So even though he wasn't the best coder, even though he wasn't the person that came up with the best devices, what Bill Gates' genius was that he was the best person at coming up with a way of getting those ideas into the hands of the consumer. And as Schumpeter rightly understood, invention is worthless without the entrepreneurial act of turning it into products that people can consume, and that is the process of genuine innovation. Similarly, we can look at some of the criticisms that were levied at Steve Jobs about how some of the people who were more kind of important to Apple's early days in terms of the technical capabilities that they had. But again, innovation is not about coming up with the best products. Innovation is about getting them to market and allowing consumers to benefit from their ability. Now, having given this view of the creative destruction entrepreneur, I just want to backtrack slightly and just pose this question about whether or not this is necessarily disruptive and introduce this concept of equilibrium. Now, the classic example of a Schumpeterian creative destruction is that we can see the carriage industry or the buggy industry, and then once Henry Ford comes along with the mass-produced motor car, we can see that the car industry completely takes over from carriages. Now, this is often used as an example of creative destruction. We can see that it's very disruptive to this particular industry. And one story is to talk about how this is going from a circumstance of kind of calm, of order, of equilibrium, and how this new product disrupts things and completely changes everything. But there is another view that we can take here, which is to say that there was always demand for faster, more affordable, more fuel efficient forms of transportation that can deliver you to a much farther range of locations. Now, in that sense, we can say that the initial circumstance was actually the period of disequilibrium because consumers' needs and demands weren't being met, and the introduction of the motor car moves us closer towards some kind of underlying equilibrium. So just to have a little think about these two different narratives here about whether or not we kind of imagine the status quo as being order and new products are then necessarily disruptive, or whether we think that before those new products exist, the fact that they don't exist, the fact that those consumers' needs are going unmet, means that we're actually living in a period of constant disequilibrium, and that it's this creatively destructive process by which we come up with innovations. The innovations, by satisfying existing consumer needs, are actually moving us closer towards a concept of equilibrium. Now, talking about bringing us closer to concepts of equilibrium, this brings us to Israel Kirzner. Now, in Kirzner's work, he was talking very much to academic economists, particularly those who in the 1970s had no concept of the entrepreneur. And what you can think of Kirzner as trying to do in his career is to reintroduce or to generate scope for entrepreneurship within standard neoclassical economic theory. He made some important assumptions. For example, he assumed that there was a single commodity and a single time period. Now, if there's a single commodity, then there's no scope for innovation. And if there's a single time period and no passage of time, then there's no real scope for uncertainty. Kirzner views entrepreneurs as those who exploit profit opportunities via riskless arbitrage. So if we think about arbitrage as being when we buy low and then sell high, that is the fundamental process by which entrepreneurs seek profit. Is they look for profits in marketplaces where prices are low, they buy, they sell when prices are high, then by exposing that arbitrage, they make a profit. In Kirzner's model, because there's no innovation and there's no uncertainty, this is riskless. So people are just going around using their alertness to notice these profit opportunities. Kirzner views profit opportunities as being everywhere, and it's the alertness of entrepreneurs that means they become aware of them and then act upon them. He defined alertness as costless discovery. So by definition, Alertness is something that you possess. You can't invest in it. You can't go to business school to become trained, to become more alert. It's just something that's kind of pervasive. It's just about whether you notice things that already exist. So, according to Kurtzner, entrepreneurs are alert. He said, I view the entrepreneur not as a source of innovative ideas, but as being alert to the opportunities that exist already. So this seems to be a big distinction with Joseph Schumpeter, where Kurtzner was saying that the entrepreneur isn't doing anything new. They're not the source of different ideas. They're simply walking around noticing profit opportunities that have been left on the table. He said, entrepreneurship does not consist of grasping a free $10 bill, which one has already discovered to be resting in one's hand. It consists in realizing that it is in one's hand and that it is available for grasp. So entrepreneurship is about this epistemic act, something that happens in the mind, which is the ability to just notice the opportunities that exist. It could be that this information is available to the entire marketplace. The entrepreneur is the person that notices a profit opportunity. And in doing so, by moving the market in the direction towards equilibrium, entrepreneurs are providing a service of coordination. They're making markets more coordinated. This gets at this fundamental question. This is often seen as the difference between Schumpeter and Kurtzner. Is the entrepreneur somebody who creates stability by providing coordination and moving the market towards equilibrium, or is the entrepreneur a disruptor and moving the markets out of it? In Kurtzner's own words, he said, for Schumpeter, the entrepreneur is the disruptive, disequilibrating force that dislodges the market from the somnolence of equilibrium. For us, the entrepreneur is the equilibrating force whose activity responds to the existing tensions and provides those corrections for which the unexploited opportunities have been crying out. Now, to try and kind of reconcile this a little bit, if you just imagine the situation that we have now, this is essentially a kind of Kurtznerian model. We've got a map here of northwest London. This is the London campus of ESCP Business School at the top there, and you can see at the bottom West Hampstead Thameslink, the train station. So if you imagine that you get off the train, imagine that it's raining, imagine that at the train you can buy an umbrella, they're available for sale. We're going to assume that there's no transaction costs. So in this Kurtznerian model, there's no costs of having to walk from West Hampstead to the business school. Everything, all of the ability to use the price mechanism is free. But just imagine that at the West Hampstead Thameslink station, umbrellas are on sale for £5. And imagine that you know that there are students on campus at ESCP who would like an umbrella given the fact that it's raining, and they're willing to pay £8 for them. This is a very simple model of riskless arbitrage where you can buy the umbrella at £5 and you can sell the umbrella at £8 and you've made yourself £3 profit. In a Kurtznerian framework, this is riskless arbitrage in the sense that we've assumed that there's no transaction costs. So we assume that there's no costs of carrying the umbrella from the station to the school. There's no uncertainty, so there's no danger that the weather changes and people's demand changes. All of that is assumed away. The process of entrepreneurship is simply noticing that these umbrellas only cost £5 in one place and people are willing to pay £8 somewhere else. And as soon as you've noticed that, it becomes a no-brainer that you will buy low and sell high and make a profit. Now, I think we can very easily change this model without losing any of the key insight to say that let's imagine that we have a similar situation, but now we have conditions of uncertainty. How does it change? And that uncertainty might be about the weather, for example. Maybe by the time you've got to ESCP, maybe it's sunny and no one wants an umbrella anymore. But assuming that we can still buy at £5, the only difference here to our model is to say that this is not necessarily a 100% known fact that people are willing to pay £8 at the school. It's simply an entrepreneurial projection. And as long as we can put this in the concept of expectations, we still have a concept here of arbitrage, but instead of arbitraging between a known input and a known output price, we're arbitraging between our understanding of the input price and our expectation of the output price. A world of uncertainty means that we don't know how much people are willing to pay at ESCP Business School, but different entrepreneurs can have a different projection of that. They will have an anticipation of how much the market is willing to pay. And then once they have that projection, they're still engaging in this arbitrage process. It's still arbitrage, and the underlying concept is still alertness, of just being alert to the fact that there's a difference between how much you think you can sell it for and how much you can buy it for. So let me consolidate some thoughts on entrepreneurship, because I'm a greedy person, and if I have some cake, I like to eat it. I've given you a view of some different concepts of entrepreneurship, but I think we can bring them together. Schumpeter does very well to provide the kind of psychological profile of an entrepreneur. So I think that's an important part of the puzzle. The descriptive account that Schumpeter has of the entrepreneur is relevant, and that's how we really view entrepreneurs in the real world. But entrepreneurship is a function, not a job description. So when people call themselves an entrepreneur, this is something that I think isn't compatible with the work that we've done so far today. Entrepreneurship is an act. It's something that we do whenever we speculate on an arbitrage opportunity in a corporate setting or in a non-corporate setting. People are engaged in entrepreneurial activity all the time, and it's the function that's relevant economically, not the individuals concerned. So entrepreneurship is a function of activity. It's not a job description. The creative destruction element is very important. The idea that when you innovate, it means that there is fundamental changes to different product lines, different industry elements as well. This is something that takes place over time and generates changes. But we can reconcile this with the equilibrating tendencies of the market in general. So entrepreneurs don't mean that we live in a world of chaos. If anything, the more entrepreneurs we have, the calmer society is, because those entrepreneurs can only make profit by bringing the market towards equilibrium. By buying low and selling high, you're establishing a market price, and you're removing inefficiencies from the marketplace. So generally speaking, entrepreneurs can creatively destruct, but they can also generate equilibrating tendencies. I think we need to take a broad view of arbitrage. So rather than a narrow view of arbitrage as just being costless and entirely riskless, we need to think of arbitrage between the passage of time as being something that is not riskless. In fact, arbitrage is something that's inherently prone to uncertainty, because when we buy and sell are going to be two different time periods, but the concept of arbitrage is still relevant. And also, entrepreneurs do not bear risk. This is the investment component of entrepreneurship. And so if we're thinking about being rewarded for bearing risk, this can be done in capital markets. When we pay people interest, for example, on money that we lend, that covers the risk of not being paid back. And so we think of that as some form of investment, but that's very different from the concept of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs go above and beyond simply bearing risk and exposing their finances to the possibility of ruin. One of my favourite formal definitions of entrepreneurship comes from Venikers and Thurek. They say entrepreneurship is the manifest ability and willingness of individuals on their own, within and outside existing organisations, to perceive and create new economic opportunities, new products, new production methods, new organisational schemes, and new product market combinations, and introduce their ideas in the market in the face of uncertainty and other obstacles by making decisions on location, form, and the use of resources and institutions. So a lot of concepts that I've explained in this lecture are demonstrated in this definition. Entrepreneurship is about individual action, but it can occur within existing organizations. It's not just about the creation of opportunities, it's about perception as well. So there's an epistemic element here. You need to be able to perceive or to notice these opportunities, you need this alertness element. Those new economic opportunities are new products, new production methods, new organizational schemes, new product market combinations. So those are all of those new combinations that Schumpeter referred to. Introducing their ideas in the market is critical. Invention is not enough. Genuine innovation involves the ideas coming to market and being in the hands of the consumer. And all this takes place under conditions of uncertainty. So that's a really nice definition of entrepreneurship that covers some of the Schumpeterian view, some of the Kurtznerian view, and also the Knightian distinction between risk and uncertainty. It's a bit hard to remember though, so if somebody says to you, what's entrepreneurship, you may not be able to reel that definition off. So if we just kind of think of the essence of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship is ultimately two things. It's noticing a profit opportunity and mobilizing the resources required to realize it. So both of those things need to go together. You need to have the epistemic element of understanding that there is a profit opportunity on the table, but then you also need to follow through and actually mobilize the resources you need to realize that profit opportunity. Okay, so it's the thought, it's also the action. The simplest definition of entrepreneurship is the undertaking of business ventures. It's not setting up a business, but it's venturing. It's venturing in a commercial setting, so we need the verb of venturing, but also the setting of the business. So it's a commercial operation. We use entrepreneurship now very broadly. We talk about social entrepreneurs. We talk about intrapreneurship, so entrepreneurship within organizations. Entrepreneurship is a very broad category. It's a function, as I mentioned before. And so I think it's good that we think of entrepreneurship very broadly. I think the reason we need to add social to entrepreneurship is to distinguish it from traditional entrepreneurship, which is about business ventures. But there's nothing to say that we can't look at that outside of a business setting in things like social entrepreneurship as well. But again, it comes back to this term undertaking. And so if you want to just have a very simple thing to remember from this session, it's that entrepreneurship is about undertaking business ventures, and our classic prototype entrepreneur is, of course, therefore, the undertaker. So once again, here he pops up. Entrepreneurship is about undertaking. But what are we undertaking? We're undertaking business ventures. We're noticing profit opportunities, and then we're realizing those profit opportunities.